In 2011, a website went live that most people were never supposed to see. It wasn't indexed by Google, it couldn't be accessed through a normal browser, and it didn't exist on the surface web. But behind layers of encryption, hidden inside the Tor network, a digital marketplace was quietly growing. Its name was Silk Road. At first glance, it looked simple: a search bar, product listings, user reviews. But what was being sold was illegal in almost every country on Earth: drugs, fake documents, hacking tools, and all of it was paid for with a new kind of money that governments barely understood at the time: Bitcoin. Within months, Silk Road was processing millions of dollars in transactions. No storefronts, no physical locations, no identifiable owner, just code, and a single administrator using the alias Dread Pirate Roberts. To some users, Silk Road was freedom, a marketplace without violence, a system without cartels, a place where transactions were voluntary and disputes were settled by moderators, not guns. To governments, it was something else entirely: a criminal empire, a direct challenge to law enforcement, and proof that the internet had crossed a line it could never uncross. But what made Silk Road truly dangerous wasn't the drugs. It was the idea behind it, because Silk Road wasn't built just to sell illegal products. It was built to prove a philosophy, one that said governments were obsolete, laws were optional, and code could replace authority. And behind that idea was a real person, a quiet physics graduate, an idealist, someone who believed he was changing the world for the better. His name was Ross Ulbricht, and by the time the FBI realized what Silk Road had become, it was already too big to shut down quietly. What followed was one of the most complex digital manhunts in history, a story involving undercover agents, betrayals, mistakes, and a life sentence that many people still argue about today. This is the true story of Silk Road, the dark web marketplace that changed the internet forever. Ross Ulbricht didn't look like a criminal. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't violent. And he didn't grow up around crime. Ross was quiet, intelligent, introspective. He was born in Austin, Texas, and from an early age, he showed a strong interest in science and systems. He studied physics, then material science, fields built on rules, structure, and logic. But outside the classroom, Ross was searching for something else: a sense of meaning, a sense of control. Friends described him as thoughtful but also distant, someone who spent a lot of time thinking about how the world should work, not how it actually did. After graduating, Ross struggled to find direction. He bounced between ideas: entrepreneurship, startups, self-sufficiency. At one point, he even tried living off the land, hoping independence would bring clarity. It didn't. What did capture his attention was ideology. Ross became deeply interested in libertarian philosophy, the belief that government interference causes more harm than good, that individuals should be free to make their own choices, even bad ones. He read obsessively: forums, books, manifestos, and one idea in particular stuck with him: that violence in illegal markets was caused by prohibition, not demand. That if people were going to buy drugs anyway, a controlled online marketplace could actually make things safer. No street dealers, no cartels, no turf wars, just anonymous buyers and sellers connected by code. To Ross, this wasn't criminal. It was economic theory, a free market experiment. And the internet, with its encryption and anonymity, finally made it possible. Around this time, Ross began experimenting with Tor, a network designed to hide users' identities by routing traffic through multiple layers of encryption. To most people, Tor was obscure. To Ross, it was liberation. It meant an idea could exist without borders, without oversight, without permission. And slowly, that idea began to take shape, not as a drug market, but as a proof of concept, a place where voluntary exchange replaced force, where trust was enforced by reputation, not law, where code, not governments, set the rules. Ross didn't see himself as a kingpin. He saw himself as an architect. And when he finally launched the site, he chose a name that reflected how he viewed the project: Silk Road, a modern version of an ancient trade route, decentralized, global, and beyond the reach of any single authority. What Ross didn't fully understand yet was that once an idea like that enters the real world, it stops belonging to the person who created it. Hacking tools, and all of it was paid for with a new kind of money that governments barely understood at the time: Bitcoin. Within months, Silk Road was processing millions of dollars in transactions. No storefronts, no physical locations, no identifiable owner, just code, and a single administrator using the alias Dread Pirate Roberts. To some users, Silk Road was freedom, a marketplace without violence, a system without cartels, a place where transactions were voluntary and disputes were settled by moderators, not guns. To governments, it was something else entirely: a criminal empire, a direct challenge to law enforcement, and proof that the internet had crossed a line it could never uncross. But what made Silk Road truly dangerous wasn't the drugs. It was the idea behind it, because Silk Road wasn't built just to sell illegal products. It was built to prove a philosophy, one that said governments were obsolete, laws were optional, and code could replace authority. And behind that idea was a real person, a quiet physics graduate, an idealist, someone who believed he was changing the world for the better. His name was Ross Ulbricht. And by the time the FBI realized what Silk Road had become, it was already too big to shut down quietly. What followed was one of the most complex digital manhunts in history, a story involving undercover agents, betrayals, mistakes, and a life sentence that many people still argue about today. This is the true story of Silk Road, the dark web marketplace that changed the internet forever. On the surface, Silk Road didn't look revolutionary. In fact, it looked familiar. A homepage, a search bar, categories. Drugs were organized by type: cannabis, stimulants, psychedelics, opioids. Each listing had prices, descriptions, and user reviews, just like Amazon. But everything about how Silk Road functioned was designed to solve one problem: trust. Because on the dark web, there are no refunds, no customer service lines, no guarantees. So Ross built a system where reputation became currency. Every vendor had a rating. Every buyer left feedback. Scammers were quickly exposed. Reliable sellers rose to the top. And unlike street deals, transactions happen without face-to-face contact. No back alleys, no handoffs, no immediate violence. But the real innovation was how payments worked. Silk Road ran entirely on Bitcoin. At the time, Bitcoin was still experimental. Few people understood it, even fewer trusted it. But Bitcoin solved two major problems. First, it allowed payments without banks. No credit cards, no chargebacks, no names attached. Second, it could be combined with Tor to obscure identities. Silk Road added another layer, an escrow system. When a buyer placed an order, the Bitcoin didn't go directly to the seller. It was held by Silk Road. Only after the buyer confirmed delivery were the funds released. If there was a dispute, moderators stepped in. Not police, not courts, just anonymous users enforcing platform rules. To Ross, this was proof that order didn't require authority. But anonymity alone wasn't enough. Shipping was the weakest link. So vendors developed their own methods: vacuum-sealed packages, odor-masking materials, fake return addresses. Some even disguised drugs as everyday products, DVD cases, electronics packaging, children's toys, and, for a while, it worked. Packages moved through normal mail systems, blending in with millions of others. Law enforcement struggled because no single piece told the full story. Bitcoin addresses weren't names. Tor traffic wasn't traceable. Mail was legally protected in many countries. Silk Road became a machine built on small legal gray areas stacked carefully together. And as confidence grew, so did the scale. More vendors joined, more buyers followed. What started as an experiment was now handling millions of dollars per month. But with growth came pressure, and with pressure came attention. Because no system, no matter how clever, stays invisible forever, especially when it starts rewriting the rules. Silk Road didn't just grow because of drugs. It grew because of Bitcoin. At the time, Bitcoin was barely understood. To most people, it was confusing, unstable, useless. But inside Silk Road, Bitcoin became essential. It wasn't just a payment method, it was protection. Every transaction used cryptographic keys instead of names. No banks, no credit card companies, no centralized authority to freeze accounts. For the first time, money could move globally without asking permission, and that changed everything. Early users didn't come for profit, they came for curiosity. Programmers, cryptography enthusiasts, libertarians, people who believed financial privacy was a human right. Forums outside the dark web began whispering about Silk Road. Not openly, not loudly, but enough. Traffic doubled, then tripled. By 2012, Silk Road was processing tens of millions of dollars in sales. Ross Ulbricht took a commission on every transaction. Small percentages, barely noticeable to users. But when multiplied across thousands of daily orders, the numbers became staggering. Ross was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars, then millions. On paper, Silk Road was anonymous. In reality, it was leaving footprints. Bitcoin transactions were public. Tor wasn't perfect. Human mistakes still mattered. But at the time, law enforcement was behind. Agents didn't understand the technology. Courts didn't understand the money. And no single agency fully grasped the scale. Silk Road felt untouchable. Inside the site, a culture formed. Users debated ethics. Vendors competed on quality. Moderators enforced rules. There were bans for scams, penalties for violence, zero tolerance for child exploitation. Ross believed this mattered, that his platform wasn't chaos. It was order without coercion. But outside the community, the narrative was changing. News articles began appearing. Amazon for drugs, dark web marketplace, digital black market. Politicians took notice. Law enforcement agencies began coordinating, and behind the scenes, Silk Road was already being watched. Undercover agents created accounts. They bought products, left reviews, messaged vendors. Each small interaction was an attempt to map the system, to understand it, to break it. And as pressure mounted, Ross began to feel it. The responsibility, the paranoia, the fear of exposure. Running Silk Road was no longer an experiment. It was a full-time operation. Mistakes became more costly. Trust became harder to maintain. And, worst of all, the line between ideology and survival started to blur. Because when a system grows that fast and challenges that much power, someone always pushes back. And the next chapter of Silk Road would take the story from innovation to something far darker. As Silk Road grew, so did the problems. Not technical ones, human ones. Vendors argued, moderators quit, scammers tested boundaries, and increasingly Ross Ulbricht found himself trying to control people he had never met. Behind the scenes, law enforcement pressure was increasing. Undercover agents were active, vendors were being arrested, some began cooperating. And, somewhere along the way, Ross became convinced that Silk Road was under direct threat from within. The first major incident involved a vendor accused of stealing large amounts of Bitcoin from the marketplace. Ross believed the theft put everything at risk, not just money, exposure. According to later court records, Ross began discussing ways to permanently remove the threat. What followed would become the most controversial part of the entire case. Through encrypted messages, Ross allegedly contacted someone he believed was a hitman. The plan, according to prosecutors, was simple. Eliminate the problem, send a message, protect Silk Road. Payments were discussed, Bitcoin was transferred, and photos were later sent as supposed proof. But here's where the story fractures. The murders never happened. The hitman was not a hitman at all. He was part of an elaborate sting. In reality, multiple law enforcement agencies were already communicating with Ross through undercover identities. The people he believed he was hiring were cooperating with authorities. The photos were staged. The deaths were fake. But the intent, according to prosecutors, was real. Ross Ulbricht was never charged with murder. No bodies existed. No victims were found. But the allegations were used at trial to paint a picture, not of an idealist, but of a man willing to cross any line to protect his creation. Supporters of Ross argue something very different, that he was manipulated, that he was under extreme psychological pressure, that he never believed anyone would actually be killed. They point out that these allegations were never tested in a murder trial, only presented as context. But regardless of interpretation, this moment changed everything. Silk Road was no longer viewed as a philosophical experiment. It was now being framed as a criminal conspiracy. And for law enforcement, it justified escalation. From that point on, the goal was no longer infiltration, it was shutdown. And the hunt for the man behind Dread Pirate Roberts moved into its final phase. By 2013, Silk Road was no longer a mystery. It was a target. Multiple agencies were now involved: the DEA, the IRS, and eventually the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The problem wasn't motivation, it was identification. Everyone knew the alias: Dread Pirate Roberts. No one knew the person. Silk Road had been designed to prevent exactly this. Tor hid IP addresses. Bitcoin hid financial trails. Users never met face-to-face, so investigators did what they always do when technology won't cooperate. They waited, they watched, and they looked for mistakes. The first real breakthrough didn't come from hacking, it came from history. Agents discovered early forum posts advertising Silk Road on the open internet. Old posts, archived threads. And in those posts, the administrator had made a critical error. He reused language, specific phrases, writing patterns, arguments about libertarian philosophy. Investigators compared them to posts made years earlier on unrelated forums. One username stood out: Ross Ulbricht. The writing style matched, the ideology matched, even the timing matched. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to justify deeper surveillance. Agents began tracking Ross's movements, his online activity, his travel. They monitored locations where he logged into the internet, libraries, cafes, shared networks. Still, nothing concrete, because Silk Road's core rule remained intact. Never log in from a traceable location, never expose the laptop, and for years, that rule held. Until one moment when everything went wrong. In October 2013, Ross was spotted inside a public library in San Francisco. To most people, it was unremarkable, just another person using a laptop. But to the FBI, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. They needed Ross logged in as Dread Pirate Roberts, and they needed his laptop open and unlocked. If the screen locked, the encryption would make it useless. So agents waited. They staged a distraction. Accounts differ on exactly how it happened, but the result was the same. Ross looked away, just for a moment. And in that moment, agents moved. They grabbed the laptop while it was still logged into Silk Road's administrator panel. The evidence was instant: messages, wallets, server access, private keys. Years of anonymity collapsed in seconds. Ross Ulbricht was arrested on the spot. For law enforcement, it was a perfect ending. For supporters of Ross, it was something else. A capture that relied not on defeating the system, but on catching a human being during a single lapse in vigilance. Either way, Silk Road was over. The site was seized, servers were taken offline, billions in Bitcoin were confiscated, and the man behind one of the most influential websites in internet history was finally revealed. But the arrest was only the beginning, because what followed would ignite years of debate about justice, punishment, and whether Ross Ulbricht was a criminal mastermind or a scapegoat for a problem governments didn't know how to solve. Ross Ulbricht's arrest sent shockwaves through the internet. Within hours, news spread that Dread Pirate Roberts was no longer anonymous. Silk Road's homepage was replaced with a seizure banner. Forums went silent. Vendors disappeared. Buyers panicked. For many users, Silk Road had felt permanent. Its sudden collapse proved it never was. Ross was charged with multiple federal crimes: drug trafficking, money laundering, computer hacking, continuing a criminal enterprise. Prosecutors painted a clear picture. They argued that Ross was not just a website operator. He was the leader of a massive illegal marketplace responsible for thousands of drug transactions around the world. They showed the jury server logs, Bitcoin wallets, private messages, evidence taken directly from Ross's laptop. To the court, the case seemed overwhelming, but Ross's defense told a different story. They argued that Silk Road had grown beyond Ross's control, that multiple people had used the Dread Pirate Roberts account over time, that Ross had stepped away from managing the site long before its peak. They also challenged how evidence was collected, questioning undercover tactics, raising concerns about corruption within the investigation. Because during the case, something unexpected surfaced. 2 federal agents involved in the Silk Road investigation were later convicted of stealing Bitcoin and manipulating evidence for personal gain. To Ross's supporters, this confirmed their worst fears, that the investigation was flawed, that the full truth had never been presented to the jury. But the court did not agree. In 2015, Ross Ulbricht was found guilty on all major counts. At sentencing, the judge delivered one of the harshest penalties ever given for a non-violent drug offense: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. No chance of release. No second sentencing hearing. Just life. The courtroom fell silent. Supporters wept. Critics applauded. And overnight, Ross Ulbricht became one of the most controversial figures in internet history. To some, he was a criminal mastermind who enabled global drug trafficking. To others, he was an idealist used as an example to scare future innovators. But regardless of opinion, the sentence sent a message. Not just about Silk Road, but about what happens when technology moves faster than the law. And yet, even after the conviction, the story did not end. Because shutting down Silk Road didn't eliminate dark web markets. It multiplied them. And in the years that followed, the internet would prove that ideas are far harder to imprison than people. When Silk Road went offline, many believed the dark web experiment was over, that the arrest of Ross Ulbricht had ended something dangerous. They were wrong. Within months, new marketplaces appeared: Silk Road 2.0, Alphabay, Hansa, dozens more. Each one borrowed the same blueprint: Tor for anonymity, Bitcoin for payments, escrow for trust. Some were larger than the original Silk Road. Some were more dangerous. Law enforcement adapted. So did the markets. Sites were seized, admins arrested, then replaced. It became a cycle. A takedown would make headlines. A replacement would quietly take its place. What Silk Road had proven was not that illegal markets could exist. That was already known. It proved they could exist without centralized violence, without street-level warfare, without borders. To critics, this was unacceptable. They argued that Silk Road normalized drug use and enabled addiction at a global scale, that no amount of ideology could justify the harm. To supporters, the argument was different. They pointed to studies suggesting that Silk Road reduced overdose deaths, that it replaced unknown street drugs with reviewed products, that it moved crime from alleyways to screens. But perhaps the most important legacy had nothing to do with drugs at all. It was about power. Silk Road showed that a single person with code and conviction could challenge governments without firing a shot. It forced law enforcement to modernize. It forced courts to confront digital evidence. And it forced the public to ask uncomfortable questions about privacy, control, and where authority truly comes from in a digital world. Ross Ulbricht remains in prison today. Appeals have failed. Clemency petitions continue. Supporters still campaign for his release. To them, his sentence represents overreach. To others, it represents accountability. But regardless of opinion, Silk Road changed the internet forever. Before it, the dark web was theoretical. After it, it was operational. And once an idea proves it can work, it never fully disappears. Because Silk Road wasn't just a website, it was a proof of concept. That markets don't require permission, that anonymity can scale, and that technology, once released into the world, cannot be easily controlled. The site is gone, the servers are silent, but the idea behind Silk Road is still alive, running quietly, somewhere in the background, waiting. Silk Road is gone, but the road it opened is still being traveled.